Content Podcast, episode 200. Environmentalist, poet, writer, and artist Maggie Chang.
I really think art is one of the most important things to help tackle issues and create social change. Because there's that quote from Maya Angelou that goes something like, people will forget what you say or do, but they'll never forget how you make them feel. And so that's I think the power of art, because it really, the feelings it evokes, that's what really sticks with people, and that's often what inspires people as well.
Maggie Chang is a poet, writer, and artist whose environmental journey started in the first grade when she learned about deforestation of the Amazon in school. Since then, Maggie has led campus second-hand clothing sales for sustainable fashion, organized a UN Sustainable Development Goal training, and helped establish Eco Schools, Canada's Youth Advisory Council, leading her to be named one of the first WWF Canada Living Planet leaders and a top 25 under 25 environmentalist in Canada. With a Bachelor of Environmental Studies, Maggie served on the Natural Resources Canada Youth Council and practiced international solidarity with fairtrade organic coffee communities with Café Femenino in Peru. Currently, she works on building an intersectional environmental movement through art and activism, and as co-chair of the City of Toronto Climate Advisory Group. Now, I first met Maggie at the Trajectories for a Just Economy event organized by FLIP, the Foundation for Leadership, Imagination, and Place, where she was presenting her exhibit of portraits of her peer BIPOC environmentalists, building on the work she did at the University of Waterloo on her undergraduate thesis, where her focus was on better racial inclusivity in the environmental field. I was impressed by her vitality and by that series of striking photographs of fellow IBPOC environmentalists. And so I wanted to know more about her views on art, science, ecology, and about her generation, Gen Z, those who are eco-art activists.
In terms of sort of what this generation is feeling around environmental stuff, I heard it was actually a sustainability, intersectional environmentalism influencer, the person who kind of coined the term, Green Girl Leah on Instagram. She said that studies have shown that millennials feel sort of a climate pessimism, but Gen Z feels climate doomism. And so that's definitely a really big challenge.
Our conversation took place in a media studio of the Toronto Public Library, which Maggie kindly set up for us. And it was good to be in a shared, publicly accessible media studio while we spoke about the role of art and its relationship with environmental studies and other cross-sections. We spoke about a lot of things, including how to manage eco-grief.
In the last maybe year or two, I had some very interesting reflections and experiences where I kind of realized that I had a lot of grief within myself around that rupture to connection to land due to migration. And really, when we think about it, everybody has a rupture in connection to land. So for me, it was because of migration, but for Indigenous folks, it was because of, the genocidal things that the Canadian government did.
I was uplifted and energized by our conversation. Maggie is very hardworking and a gifted environmentalist and artist. And I think the world needs more art and science bridge builders like Maggie. I like the way she weaves networks and considers them as a form of biodiversity. And this type of resilience and vision is critical to our collective future, which is in the hands of Maggie and her peers.
It's just like biodiversity. You know, when you have a more biodiverse ecosystem, you have more redundancy that's built into it. And so even when certain aspects of it are, not as strong, you have these networks that can still fill those spaces. And it's just like with our community, when we strengthen our community and we create more connections between us, even when certain parts of the community maybe have a bad season or they have to slow down for a little bit, we can still create wonderful things because we have enough connections to fill in those gaps. Just like biodiversity, right?
With thanks to the Toronto Public Library for use of the studio and to Maggie for her time. We're at the Toronto Public Library with Maggie Chang. Welcome.
Hi, it's great to be here.
So where are we? That's a good question, right? We're in like a production studio, so it's really cool to be here. What is it?
So they call it an audiovisual studio on the website. So basically people, I guess, book it out for like various audio things like podcasts, music videos, and like that kind of thing. And I guess if they can film something in the small space, then they probably use it to film as well. It's a free resource that people are able to use just with a library card. And they have a couple of locations at a couple of libraries across the city.
Cool. Well, it's nice to take advantage of that public resource for our conversation today. So Maggie, we met briefly at an event in Toronto organized by FLIP, the Foundation for Leadership, Imagination and Place. And you remember what it was called, right?
Yes, it's the Trajectories of a Just Economy.
All right. Whatever that is. But what I saw was a lot of art by emerging artists of different backgrounds in Toronto. And some really beautiful things, and lots of time to ask questions. And you gave a presentation, and I saw these murals that you had done, or not murals, but photographic works that were quite impressive. And then we had a chat, and you talked to me about your background, your interest in arts, and I said, well, we should talk. And so here we are.
Yes.
Talking about what your work is. Now you're on the younger side of my guests, which is nice. So there's a generational difference there, and so I'm interested in your views, your generational views of that. And we'll just chat about art and science and all community arts and all these things. But since I barely know you and our audience doesn't, why don't you start with a little introduction?
I feel like I always have like the kind of same spiel because I have to introduce myself a lot in these environmental spaces because I'm a speaker or whatever. But I guess the story starts actually in first grade. That was when I was when I first started becoming interested in environmental issues, because I learned about deforestation in the Amazon at school, and I was absolutely outraged. It just seemed really unjust to me, and I don't know if it's a memory or if I'm making it up or whatever, but I remember being in that first grade classroom and the kids are like talking about it, and they're like, this doesn't make any sense because destroying the environment is just destroying ourselves. And, as I continue...
Wisdom of children.
Exactly, right? And so, as I grow up, I continue to think about how it does seem like that the adults don't understand that, which is very interesting. But anyway, so I became very interested in environmental issues and started, doing whatever I could to help the environment, recycling, and all of those kids stuff. Eventually, I realized that I could actually pursue a career in that. So I went to the University of Waterloo for environmental studies. It was a really interdisciplinary degree, so I did learn about sort of the ecology aspect, but I think I personally focused a lot on the social sciences as well. And that led me to writing my thesis, which, is a very big part of my interests and the work that I try to continue to do, because it was on sort of better racial inclusivity in the environmental field. More specifically, it was about sort of looking, I talked to the youth around me who were racialized, and I just asked them about sort of the barriers and the opportunities that they experienced in accessing and continuing in the environmental field. Because I'm just like a really big equity person and a really big on sort of the intersection of equity and environmentalism. And now that's like led off to various things like the event that we met at. My project was kind of a continuation of my thesis. And also I'm on a bunch of committees and councils and stuff like that. Last year I was on the Natural Resources Canada Youth Council, and currently I'm one of the co-chairs of the City of Toronto Climate Advisory Group.
Well, that sounds important, because there are some climate problems here in Toronto, from what I hear, everywhere in the country.
Yeah.
Did you experience them directly, these floods?
No, so I live sort of in an inner suburb, if you will. So we have a lot more sort of green spaces and lawns and like that kind of stuff, a little less concrete. So we don't necessarily see as much flooding, although in the past there was some basement flooding issues, but they built like a storm management thing that has helped mitigate that. But when the big rainstorms came, I just like knew in my head that downtown was going to flood.
And they probably did as well. I'm hoping it wouldn't, but anyway, that's since we're here in Toronto, I just want to raise that. So yeah, what I saw was interesting, because they're, BIPOC people or racialized people, as you say, looking very dignified, artistically. So what was and there was a nice text that explained their statement from the different, and they're all scientists, they're all
environmentalists.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so tell me about the artistic or the cultural side of what you're trying to do with those series of portraits.
Yeah, so it's kind of actually a long story, but
we got time.
That's great. But it starts with, I guess, my thesis. And so one of the things that came out while I was just interviewing people and doing the focus groups and all of that data collection was that there was a lack of self-representation. And that didn't necessarily create sort of a direct barrier for people in terms of maybe there was like a lack of self-representation, and that kind of created an indirect barrier, if you will, around people, finding it hard to find mentors who maybe understood them, people who didn't necessarily feel safe in like the fact that like they do belong in this space, or people who, dealt with, unfortunately, like discriminatory like ideas and perceptions, and people like didn't know what paths could exist for them to have a career in kind of this kind of space, and they didn't feel safe that like they could continue and succeed, right? And so somebody told a story about how there was like a social media feature or something of a scientist who looked just like her, like she was South Asian, had curly hair and like these glasses and all of that, and she said she looked at it and she just cried, because she had never seen somebody look like her, be part of the space and be succeeding and doing really awesome, exciting things. So that fact that there was a lack of self-representation, I was like, well, why don't I start chipping away with that by like literally creating these portraits? And it was a really interesting learning experience for me, because when I sort of first envisioned the project, I kind of I expected I would be photographing quote unquote badass portraits. That's kind of what I was thinking about.
There's a bit of that.
Yeah. Yeah, and there definitely was. There's definitely a lot of folks looking very, badass or dignified, as you said. But something else that like came out during the process that I think is really important to highlight as well is that a lot of the portraits were also very joyful. And that came out because it was very important to me to kind of create as much co-creation in the project as I wanted, as possible. And so, with every person I talk to, I ask them, like, do you like think about like what you want to look like in this photo? And a lot of the people actually came back saying they wanted to look sort of like happy or joyful.
That's the way they feel inside.
Yeah, that's the way they feel inside. And I think it was a good reminder to me as well, because, as the younger generation with environmental issues, a lot of us it feels very heavy for us in a lot of ways. But also, like, there's a lot of joy in it as well, because we love, the community. We love how beautiful and wonderful the world is. And so it was just a really important, really lovely reminder that, there's also joy, and that we can't forget the joy. And the joy is actually how we keep from, burning out, and make sure to continue to fill our cups to be able to continue doing this work as, whole, awesome people. So, my training, I guess, as an artist was actually more in writing. I did do a couple of creative writing courses, but as with writing and photography, a lot of it was sort of like self-training, experimentation and research and like that kind of stuff. The background is that I did do photography kind of as a hobby for about 10 years. So I wouldn't say that I don't have experience, but it definitely was my first time doing photography in a sort of more professional way, where the stakes were higher. I was using an actual DSLR for the first time. So that was kind of that aspect of that. And then the other thing I did was I actually ended up getting a lot of like social media ads for photography things.
Google search.
Exactly. So a bunch of like master classes and like online courses came up, and I was like, they're giving me a free trial. I might as well try this out. And it ended up being some really good information about just like tips and tricks about posing people and how to take their portrait, and how it's actually a lot about sort of just like rotating and trying different angles, and then having good lighting depending on the time of day. And so those kinds of things I think gave me confidence. And then the other aspect was that like all of my participants were actually people that I knew, and so there's this sort of inherent rapport there. So while for them it was like a very vulnerable experience, because having your picture taken is a very vulnerable thing, it was also vulnerable for me, because I was like, I don't feel like I'm qualified for this. But because you kind of know each other and you trust each other, that really helped, and it made it a lot easier.
Mm-hmm. Well, the reason I'm asking about the process, and I don't mean to say you're not a photographer, you are, because I saw some beautiful work, is I'm leading to the relationship between art and your training as an environmentalist, because this podcast is about art and the ecological crisis, and you're more on the science side than the art side, though maybe you'll be doing more in the future, I don't know. How do you feel about art and its place in and around these complex issues?
I really think art is one of the most important things to like help tackle issues and create social change. Because, there's that quote from Maya Angelou that goes something like, people will forget what you say or do, but they'll never forget how you make them feel. And so, like, that's I think the power of art, because it really, like, the feelings it evokes, that's what really sticks with people, and and that's often what like inspires people as well. Like in my interviews with my thesis, for example, a lot of people talked about how it was actually sort of like documentaries that like really riled them up to create change and want to join the environmental field. And I just think it's just so important and powerful to sort of just capture people's hearts and minds and change minds and create change, because people are, afraid, or they just like to keep things the same a lot. And so when you have something really inspiring like art, like that's such an important thing to get people to feel okay and feel safe in change. And we desperately need change.
Well, that makes sense to me, in music to my ears, in the sense that I agree with you fully, and I've experienced it, and I think you have as well. But it's hard to do at a certain scale, right? Because how do you then have those stories and those feelings, and it's all, the language is difficult to describe, but we know what we're talking about. You go to a play and you might not remember all the words, but you remember some of the gestures and some of the feelings that you had of sorrow or of joy. And I remember going to lectures, a 2-hour lecture. How much are you going to remember? I often remembered the stories.
Yeah.
There would be an analogy or just a encapsulation of everything that's being said in another way that was easier for me to retain. So that's... Yeah, and then what's it like being an environmentalist these days? Looking for work?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. And I just want to go back to that point you made about storytelling real quickly, because I wholeheartedly agree as well. And like, that's a huge reason why I leaned into the storytelling aspect for this photo project as well. Some people might have called it photojournalism. I kind of called it a photo portrait and story capture thing, however you want to term it, because that's exactly it. I found that like the stories are such a powerful way to just make things stick in people's minds. And it's also the fact that a lot of like racialized or BIPOC voices in the environmental field are not necessarily given the platform that they deserve, or they're just sort of like not talked about. And so I really wanted to have the project also be part of amplifying their voices. And the third thing that I didn't mention earlier was that in the last maybe year or two, I had some very interesting reflections and experiences where I kind of realized that I had a lot of grief within myself around that rupture to connection to land due to migration. And really, when we think about it, everybody has a rupture in connection to land. So for me, it was because of migration, but for Indigenous folks, it was because of, the genocidal things that the Canadian government did. For other people who have been, settlers on this land for longer, they had that rupture in connection to land for further back, but it still happened. And I just felt like nobody was talking about this at all. I felt like I was the only one who really even had this reflection, and it also took me 20-something years to really even realize that I had it within me. And so I wanted to have the stories talk about this, so that we can create more stories and more voices and more reflections about this issue, and also hopefully encourage people to reflect and start working on their healing journey.
Yeah, and allow people to voice their stories in however they see fit, and not fitting a certain narrative, a certain framing that could not be their story. It could be distorted.
Right.
So I'm thinking about some of the barriers you're talking about. Certainly not feeling welcome is very traumatizing for somebody and that might be unconscious on the part of the teachers, but it's still there.
Yeah, for sure.
Can you give an example of that? Like a barrier, like you gave an example earlier of somebody in class not feeling comfortable, I don't know, what you said exactly, but I'm looking for an example of the kind of thing that if we were aware of it, we could not do in terms of making somebody, say, who wants to become an environmentalist feel comfortable, who might be an immigrant or might not be in the mainstream.
So probably the most common example that I've come across is when people are in environmental spaces and camping comes out, and then usually a lot of immigrant people have never been camping. And people are just like, what? You've never been camping? And then they just make them feel very weird that they haven't been camping, and then they feel sort of alienated, and then it feels very awkward, and they feel very unwelcome, And then so it's just tiny little things like that. These, I guess you could call them microaggressions, that kind of
I've probably done it myself.
That kind of all build up to make people feel like they don't belong. One of the things that I found during my research was that, granted, with the caveat that my sample size was not huge, right? But some of the things that my participants were saying was that, or the pattern that I kind of noticed was that a lot of them were inspired to sort of be involved in the environmental field from a more environmental justice perspective. So it was because they had family, for example, who are being disproportionately affected by climate change. We learn about that in an academic setting here in Canada, but this is actually happening to people's families back home, right? And so that's a very close tie to that environmental justice thing. And so it actually often had a lot of connection to people and how climate change was affecting people that inspired a lot of people. It was also around kind of, concern about sort of the neo-colonial aspects of the environmental field. And, if you trace back the modern day environmental movement, a lot of it really goes back to Indigenous peoples being displaced off their land to create national parks. Right? So this entire field kind of has a history that's seeped in, that's not particularly inviting to BIPOC folks. And so one of the things that I recommended in my thesis was just that it's really important to widen the stories of what we talk about in terms of who an environmentalist is and what environmentalism looks like. So immigrant or racialized families, and oftentimes in Canada, those demographics overlap a lot. We might not go to a park to go hiking or kayaking or whatever, but we might go there for a picnic. And that's still a legitimate use of that natural space, and it's still enjoying it. And so just trying to be open-minded and recognizing that maybe our own experience isn't everybody's experience, and that's okay, can go a long way.
Well, and coming back to art, my daughter's a scientist. She's works in Earth system science, and I talk to her about her because she's one of the reasons I started this podcast back in 2019. She asked me, you know the story? No. She was 17 and she was asking me, well, I'm interested in science, but I want to know what I can do to help climate change, to address climate change. And I said, well, what do you want to do? And no, what I want to do is what do I need to do? And I said, well, you got to do what you love, and then then your passion will be there. And so she ended up choosing system science. But that really affected me to think that a young person wouldn't follow necessarily what they want to do, but what they think needs to be done, you know. And I bet there's some pressure on you as an environmentalist to do the right thing, you know.
Yeah.
I'm interested in what you want to do. Like, where are you going with your interests in environmentalism, but more broadly, you know, that connection between art, science, and social science that you talked about earlier. It's like, as a young person, what do you aspire to do with all this knowledge that you have, and your skill and your energy and your commitment and your talent?
You know, I was looking at that sort of suggested question of like, what are you working on? I was like, I just did a huge art showcase.
Then you're resting.
Why do I have to do something else? But then I was like, no, wait, but it's me. I actually am working on 12 different things.
Of course, yeah.
You know? So just that caveat that it is very important to rest. And this has kind of been a theme, I guess, this year of a couple of conferences and things that I've been to, the importance of rest. And I had some very interesting reflections where it's really nice being at those kind of conference spaces, because you literally see right in front of you, like, all of these people doing such fantastic things for the environment. And then it makes you feel like you're not alone in it, and that you don't always have to be on, because other people are going to be there to, you know, take up the torch if you want to rest for a bit. But in terms of like what I have going on, sort of a, I guess, low-hanging fruit thing is I'm looking into grants actually for expanding my photo portrait series and interviews. I like talked to somebody at the Toronto Arts Council, and they said that it definitely would fit under their guidelines. And so at some point when I feel like writing a very formal grant and putting all of that labor into it, I want to do that. Something else that I'm working on, which is, I guess, my next big project, is kind of trying to set up we don't have a formal name for it yet, but like a climate community for kind of the inner suburbs and the suburby area in Toronto. So I live in North York, which is an inner suburb, and then my collaborator lives in York region. And we kind of have just noticed, and a lot of the conferences and stuff I've been to have also mentioned this, that if there is community for sort of climate related stuff in Toronto, it's all downtown. And like for me, I'm like relatively well connected with the subway, but it still takes like an hour and a half sometimes to get to these downtown meeting places, and that's just not accessible for folks. And so we're really interested in kind of just creating a really grassroots space where we're kind of building community and connecting to each other and talking to people about sort of our experiences. We want it to be very sort of like BIPOC forward. And, you know, part of that inspiration is actually one of my interviews for my photo project. One of my participants, mentioned that she was actually so grateful that I was doing this project, because some of the stories that she was telling about sort of how it's kind of awkward when your environmental organization has like a DEI policy, and you kind of have to wonder, like, did I only get this job because I'm racialized? Or how, you know, being the only like BIPOC person at your environmental organization can be strange, and they might like try to tokenize you in during like Black History Month or like that kind of thing. And she said that she didn't have anywhere else where she could really tell these stories or talk about these things. And so that was really inspiring to me, because I was like, oh, I really want to create a space where people can talk about these things. And as sort of like 20 somethings who have graduated, we really noticed and feel that like after you leave a university campus, it's really hard to find that community in those spaces to kind of talk to people and just be in community. And so trying to find ways to, I guess, build that similar community feeling as a campus without necessarily the campus. And then the other thing that I've been working on very hard recently is actually my novel. Yeah.
You're just going to drop that on me?
I mentioned that my formal training, or my like most central arts practice, is actually writing. And so I'm working on, or I wrote a novel I started a novel when I was like 14. And then I finished it during sort of the pandemic and the lockdowns of 2020 when I had a lot of time. I spent like 2 years like working with beta readers and like revising it and like all of that kind of stuff. And I also was querying for a literary agent at that time. And, you know, when you said earlier that sometimes artistic folks kind of are not racialized artists, are not necessarily always understood by the institutional structures in North America. I definitely had some like personal experience with that, with sort of the queering world. So it put me off it for a while, but I kind of recently found some inspiration again to kind of go back to the novel, try to revamp it a little bit, also work on like book 2 and that kind of stuff. And it's very interesting when I look at that book because I didn't set off to make it like very environmental or anything, but when you look at like sort of the themes where, you know, there's a lot of like care toward nature and reciprocity and consent, there's a lot of sort of like wonder, and it mostly takes place in a magical forest, right?
My favorite kind of place.
Exactly. So there's a lot of like environment and connection and harmony and reciprocity, and then the other theme is also sort of, it's very anti-colonial, anti-war, and you know, I don't know how much people know about it these days, but war is also very terrible for the environment, as well as for sort of equity and all of these things that I care about. So it's very interesting to see that just, you know, even at like 14 or like I think it was 13 and like 11 months actually when I started the idea. I didn't know anything, but it was still like so me that all of these things just ended up in the book as themes and central components of it anyway.
Well, I look forward to hearing about that because there's a growing literature of, some people call it cli-fi, you know. Cli-fi. Yeah. Yours might or might not be that, but it's interesting to have that, your background both as an artist and a scientist, and then that social vocation of using literature to tell people stories, not necessarily try to convince them to be more aware, but just to experience, you know, whatever it is your story is. But I'm glad you're doing that. I don't have that skill, but I have a sound background, so I try to tell stories through soundscapes, you know, which is another way of communicating. So Maggie, I wanted to start wrapping up, but I want to hear about how you feel about what is called societal collapse, because it's a term that's used in a movement called deep adaptation. You might have heard Jem Bendel and all that. Yeah. How do you relate to that? Like, are you a collapse accepting kind of person, or where do you fall on that spectrum? Doomist, I don't know.
Well, I definitely I had a lot of struggles with it, I would say, over the past particularly year. But something that was very interesting that I came across at one of my dozens of conferences that I've been to this year was that they had sort of a climate anxiety session, and it was done by the person who founded psychiatry, TREE. And the thing that he said that was very interesting, that I found very comforting, was that sort of when you look at this cycle of things that are happening, part of it, you might start understanding that some things, he said that like when you look at what's going on and you have an understanding of like how things work in cycles, you start understanding that some things actually need to collapse in order to make room for new structures and systems that work better. And so you kind of can start finding maybe a little bit of hope, or at least not doomism.
or clarity anyway.
Yeah, when you start understanding that, because collapse isn't necessarily completely a bad thing. In some ways, it will be a bad thing, and some people will be disproportionately affected, and they're often folks who have had the least to do with the problem, which is a really big justice issue, but also it creates room for sort of hope and creating new systems. And I think that's why I really lean into community as well, and I lean into equity, because when you take away the barriers that people are experiencing, you have more people who can be climate warriors to like take part of this work and do important things. When you take away the barriers, people start seeing themselves as part of the movement, and you start getting the coalitions you need to create the big societal change that we need to, radically shift our lives to a way that's sustainable. And when you take away the barriers, as studies have shown, we get more innovative and interesting and high quality work. When diverse teams come together, they tend to do better stuff. And so all of that is coming together, I think, to create climate, or to really activate the climate solutions that we have.
Well, I was just at the Center for Social Innovation before this meeting, and we were talking about, the cycles around permaculture and some of the values around permaculture, which is of interest because there's a model there, and that the word permaculture is very broad. You're talking about a more organic approach to natural cycles, and it's true that the panarchy cycle, you probably studied that. It goes up and it goes down, and there's regeneration and there's destruction. But now it's such a difficult time because so many systems are vulnerable: ecological systems, economic systems, there's population density issues, there's all kinds of things that are there in parallel, and it's a great time to be alive, and it's a terrible time to be alive, right? And you're going to be around a lot longer than I am, so I'm wondering, I'm glad you talked about the sort of eco-anxiety side of things, and how that can be reduced or contextualized anyway. But I'm just wondering how young people, without generalizing because everybody's different, but how young people are feeling and dealing, and what they need from older people like me. I mean, obviously you need opportunities to make a living and so on.
We need money.
Well, that's fine. Money to do what you want to do.
Yeah.
Like jobs kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, if I want to be very, very vulnerable right now, I think part of the issue is also that, like with the recession, like I was laid off, and part of the challenge is with like Canadian society, which is so like hyper independent, maybe not as much as the States, but still very independent, or focused on the individual.
Individualistic. Yeah.
Individualistic. You don't feel safe when you're not working a stable job necessarily. And that can be very challenging. And in terms of sort of like what this generation is feeling around environmental stuff, I heard it was actually a sustainability, intersectional environmentalism influencer, the person who kind of coined the term, Green Girl Leah on Instagram. She said that studies have shown that like millennials feel sort of a climate pessimism, but Gen Z feels climate doomism. And so like that's definitely a really big challenge. And I think part of it is just a lack of the full breadth of solutions that we have permeating society. Because I went through like, environmental studies at university, I actually know that there are a lot of solutions out there, and there's a lot of ways that like humans can work to improve the environment. And you see that through like indigenous knowledge and indigenous practices. But I don't think a lot of people know about these things. And then also when people know about things, it doesn't always necessarily, it isn't the full recipe to like create the change and the inspiration that people need. And then the other thing that I was going to mention is that I don't personally resonate very much with the term eco-anxiety. I resonate more with, I guess, climate distress. And I think because in at least my circles, like racialized or BIPOC environmentalists, one of the things that we've kind of felt is that climate anxiety, at least that term can be, those spaces can be very sort of like white centric. And it can be a little bit more about sort of only concern for losing sort of beauty and aesthetic things, which access, yeah, which is very important. And as I mentioned before, not all of us do access these environmental spaces through things like camping and kayaking and hiking and all of that kind of thing. And so that doesn't necessarily resonate with us as much. And then something else I talk to my friends about is the fact that like as racialized peoples, we tend to have very immediate issues that are challenging our communities, that are more existential immediately than sort of climate, where we have I don't want to say like poverty because it feels very disempowering, but like racialized folks are disproportionately more poor. And there's, racism and police brutality and like all of those kinds of things. And so
the term precarity comes to mind,
Yeah.
Because it's not necessarily a permanent situation, but when precarious is more like a fragility. It might be a temporary fragility, but when you don't have adequate housing, you don't have adequate, when you feel insecure, then you are in a precarious situation.
Yeah. So like being in a precarious situation with very existential immediate threats, it can be an interesting challenge to feel the existential threat of climate change, which while we do see it happening through like these rainstorms and these heat waves, is not as like, doesn't feel as immediately life threatening as some of these other like issues that our community is facing. And so I kind of felt like, I personally feel like climate distress kind of like encompasses it a little bit more. And it, I guess, also encompasses how climate issues exacerbate some of the issues that we are facing. So I guess eco-anxiety feels a little bit more individualistic to me, and then climate distress is a little bit more holistic.
I appreciate you're very candid and brilliant, and I hope you have a nice career in both art and science and whatever else you want to do, because what I saw at the flip, now I'll get the acronym right again, because I want to give credit to them because they convened this activity, the Foundation for Leadership, Imagination and Place here in Toronto.
I will also clarify though that, so the art was part of the Trajectories of Now showcase.
Yeah.
So that was adjacent, but it kind of just was the setting that Flip held the event.
Right. Yeah, it was like a context. We went into a space where there was a residency, but it was a nice synergy too, because Flip was, and I'm just going to read their mandate here, working alongside emergent leadership, particularly QT and BIPOC creatives, to transform arts and communities in Canada. So this idea of transformation is trying to deal with some of these barriers and some of these ways of being that are problematic. And we know that art does amazing things. Sometimes it's a slow burn, right? It doesn't have an immediate effect. Like the effect of your artwork on me was slow, but I remembered it. I remembered le regard in French, the way they look at me.
Yeah.
I don't remember the texts, I don't remember their names, but I remember the way that's like going back to what you said about what art does is bring us an experience that's not necessarily, rational or logical. It's just somewhere else in our being that we call upon. So Maggie, why don't we end with what I usually do, which is ask you what you're reading and listening. Is anything that you recommend to listeners that you're currently devouring?
Yeah, so I guess this is a symptom of the younger generation. A lot of this is Instagram centric, but I figure it's good to recommend for folks who aren't as aware of the spaces on Instagram. But there's a podcast called the Green Dreamer Podcast.
Oh, I know it well.
Yeah, right. So I think that one does a lot of very interesting, very nuanced work that also centers a lot of sort of Indigenous and racialized experiences and perspectives on the climate crisis. And I really appreciate sort of all of the educational value and interesting insights that one provides in terms of sort of like specific accounts, as if you will. The Green Girl Leah account definitely does a lot of very good.
The what girl?
Green Girl Leah.
Okay.
So I think that's exactly her handle. It's like at Green Girl Leah. She does a lot of her entire thing is focusing on intersectional environmentalism in, I think, a very accessible way. And then sort of on more of an arts or social good aspect, I look a lot at sort of what the Ontario Canada Project, and that handle is, I think, On Canada Project. They're kind of a more general media account that focuses on sort of social good. So they talk about everything from like politics to integrating like environmental issues into your social justice work. And then the more artistic account, which reposts a lot of sort of important issues, is Art House TO. And there's also Climate Justice TO, I think, who are doing some really interesting work with solidarity for the rent strikes in Toronto. And I think they really have it right, where the climate movement really needs to do a lot of coalition building and supporting others in coalition in order to get the support that we need to create change.
And it sounds like the art of photography comes in there as a way of portraying or enhancing the stories, because Instagram's mostly visual, though it has.
It's a lot of videos and reels now, but
right, yeah.
Definitely the visual aspect and the connecting to people, I think, is a lot of the appeal.
Well, that's really great. I wanted to talk about community engaged arts, and I want to talk about art and science, and I want to talk about all kinds of things, but we'll just talk again. How's that? Because we've been at it for 48 minutes now. I think we're going to give our listeners a break, but I will give you a chance. Is there anything that you haven't said that you want to say?
Well, so yeah, for sure. I think one of the reasons that I've turned a lot towards sort of like youth empowerment and youth focus, like I'm going to the Toronto Youth Environmental Council conference on August 3rd to be a speaker, and just my workshop is around coaching these like teenagers, these high schoolers, on like what they should think through to do their environmental initiatives as sort of like an older youth, because I had a lot of opportunities as a young person, and I had a lot of support to be able to do a lot of the things that I was able to do, a lot of opportunities, and I wanted to kind of pass that forward as much as I can. And also, as we were talking about earlier, with that climate doomism that is very prominent in this generation, I think it's really important to be part of like showing the young people that this is actually what you can do, and you yourselves are already very powerful. And the analogy that I created, or the analogy that I thought about, I think you'll like this because it connects sort of the social and the science aspect of why strengthening community is so important and why I focus so much on it, is because it's just like biodiversity. You know, when you have a more biodiverse ecosystem, you have more redundancy that's built into it. And so even when certain aspects of it are, not as strong, you have these networks that can still fill those spaces. And it's just like with our community, when we strengthen our community and we create more connections between us, even when certain parts of the community maybe have a bad season or they have to slow down for a little bit, we can still create wonderful things because we have enough connections to fill in those gaps. Just like biodiversity, right?
That's beautiful, and that's a great model. It's like, let's not over-relate, but relate a lot, so that there's ways for things to be caught instead of being so thin on the ground. We have this richness of relations and connections and bio and cultural diversity and all these things. And I agree with you. And we are building that. I see it. What I see as a gap is just connections. Now, you talked about doing things in your suburbs, so to speak, instead of coming downtown. Just do it regionally. That makes a lot of sense. And then those little hubs need to be connected. So let's do that. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's connect the world.
Yes.
Thank you, Maggie.
You're very welcome.